Hi guys, my name is Victor and I'm a backend developer at Wolfpack Digital. We are working with Ruby on Rails, and for our backend projects we usually integrate a continuous integration tool. We usually use Circle CI, but for smaller projects we think that GitHub Actions is a great tool. If you already have a GitHub repository, that means that you already have this tab, and the cool thing about GitHub Actions is they actually come with a lot of starter repositories for you to just copy paste, and you already have a starter. So for this project and for this video, we are going to go through a very small Rails app that only has a few tests. We are also going to run Robocop, and we want to do it on each pull request that we create. Why do we want to do that? Because we want to make sure that before every deployment, before every code review and so on, we have everything in place, our tests don't fail, and our code is just as we want it. In order to create a GitHub action template, all we need to do is create a .github folder and inside it a workflows folder. In order to create actual workflows, we need YAML files. We can create as many as we want, but I'm just going to create one for this example, and I'm going to call it main. This is going to go pretty easy as if you already know other CI tools, but I'm just going to give it a name. Let's call it a continuous integration. You can give it any name you want, and I'm just going to tell it on which branch to run. In this case, I'm going to tell it I want to run it only on pull requests and only on the main branch. You can use it with any branches, you can use it on commits, you can use it on merges, but in our case, I only want it on main pull requests. After we define it, when to trigger it, we also need to define the jobs. I'm only going to need one job called main, but you can also do secondary, third, and so on. Before we define the steps that we need our job to do, we need to define the services and dependencies that we have. In my case, I have a Postgres database. If you have MySQL or any other type of database, you can use that also because GitHub Actions does support a large amount of databases. I'm going to set the image, and then I'm going to send the Postgres user and the Postgres password, which are the default ones in my case. This is going to be the Postgres that's actually installed on the GitHub Actions machine. Before setting up the ports, I also want to set a few options, which is basically just the health check for the Postgres to make sure that we have the database in place before we run tests. This only fails if the Postgres fails, if the installment fails, so it's usually just a safety check. It's not necessarily something that we need to do every time. I'm also going to define the ports, which again are the default ones. And in my case, this is the only service that I use. If you want to set up GitHub Actions to also deploy your app, then you're also going to need some other services like Heroku or Azure, AWS, and so on. After the services, I also need to tell GitHub which type of machine to work on, and in this case, I'm gonna work on the Ubuntu latest. Why did I choose Ubuntu latest? As I mentioned, GitHub Actions has a lot of starter repositories. A great one for Ruby is called Setup Ruby, which has in place the interpreter and some dependencies, and it does work on Ubuntu latest. It also works on macOS and Windows if you want, but in this case, I'm gonna use the Ubuntu latest. So in that case, I'm gonna use the example they have, and I'm also gonna use the actions checkout and setup Ruby default, so I don't have to write everything myself every time. After I define that, I also need to define the steps. You can take the steps as each step the GitHub Actions CI needs to do. First of all, it's gonna be setting up Ruby, installing dependencies, installing gems, and then we can have the setup database with RSpec on the test environment and the Robocop step. So just as mentioned before, I'm gonna use the actions checkout v2 just as in the example, and I'm also gonna use the setup Ruby command, which uses Ruby setup v1 in their example, and I'm gonna set up my own Ruby version, which in my case is 2.6.5. You can take the Ruby version from the gem file. Okay. After I set up Ruby, I do need to install the dependencies. In this case, the dependencies that I use are something called libpqdev, which basically lets us use Rails with Postgres, and also the bundler, because I do need to install the gems. So I'm just going to run a simple command. I'm just going to copy paste this because it's much easier. You can find them on very many examples. After I install the bundler, I also going to need to install the gems, which is very similar to what I have above, but in this case I'm going to do bundle install. Good. So I do have the gems, I do have Ruby installed, I do have the Postgres service available, so I can already tell the machine to install the database and then run the test. So initially I'm going to prepare database. I'm going to use the environment variables that I did define in my Rails app. So I'm going to need the Postgres host, which is localhost in my case, the Postgres user, which is going to be Postgres, the Postgres password, which is going to be the same, and the Rails environment that I want the test to be run on, which is obviously going to be test. And then I'm going to do bundle exec Rails db prepare. So database prepare actually does database create, database migrate, and database seed. You can also do anything else that you need. Okay. After that, I'm going to copy paste this and try to run the tests. Run aspect tests. In this case, I'm also going to need the same environment variables because each step needs to be defined on which database I'm going to use and so on. So I'm going to do bundle exec rspec. And after that, I also want to run Rubocop, which is going to be a simple copy paste. But fortunately for Rubocop, we do not need a database. So in this case, I'm only going to do bundle exec Rubocop. This is everything that we need. The steps are pretty much the same when we do it ourselves on our machine. We can see here that when I run rspec, the tests are going to run, same for Rubocop, and we actually want to do the same on the GitHub Actions. So right now I'm going to create a pull request with everything that I've done. Create main workflow with rspec and Rubocop. Gonna push my code and create a pull request. So I have created a pull request, and in my pull request I can already see that the CI tool queued a run. It's in progress, and when I go to the actions part, I can see that my workflow is running. The cool thing with GitHub Actions is that it shows me each step. It sets up the job, now it's initializing the container with the Ubuntu latest details that I sent it, and then it's gonna set up Ruby, install the dependencies, and everything else. Usually this goes pretty fast because we only have a few gems to install, Postgres is pretty easy to install, and we shouldn't have any issues. Okay, so I fast forwarded a little bit over the last part, but we can now see each step that was run. We can see that Rubocop was run, we had inspected 32 files, everything was fine, no offenses detected. Same for rspec, we can see that it used the Postgres settings that we sent, 14 examples and 0 failures. just like we had on our own example. Right now, we can go back to the pull request, and we can also see that our checks have passed. Now, each time I create a new pull request on this branch towards the main branch, GitHub Actions will create a new workflow to run on. That's it from my side. We will push the code, and the link is included in the comments. Have fun.